today, we will slowly explore the rise of a land that stood at the center of the ancient world, a land that built one of the greatest empires humanity had ever seen, an empire that stretched across continents, that ruled over millions, and that shaped the way civilizations would govern, trade, and live for centuries to come. This was a land that rose from quiet beginnings to become a superpower of its time, a force so vast that it connected the worlds of Asia, Africa, and Europe. And yet, despite being conquered, broken, and reshaped again and again by Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, and others, it never truly disappeared. Because each time it was brought down, it rose again, carrying its identity forward in a way few civilizations ever could. Tonight, we will not rush through this story, and we will not simply list events or names as if history were something distant and disconnected, but instead, we will gently move through time itself, beginning from the earliest moments of civilization on this ancient land, through the rise of the great Persian Empire, through its fall and rebirth, and all the way to the modern nation we now call Iran. Allowing each era to unfold slowly, calmly, and naturally, as if you were walking through it step by step, without effort, without urgency, simply observing as one of the oldest continuous civilizations in the world reveals its story. There is a land far older than the borders we see on maps today, a land of vast deserts that stretch quietly beneath endless skies, of mountains that rise like silent guardians over time itself, and of winds that have carried the stories of countless generations across centuries without ever truly losing them. A land that the world now calls Iran, but which was once known by another name, a name that echoes softly through history: Persia. This is not just the story of a country, and it is not simply the story of kings or battles or empires, but something deeper and more enduring. Because this is a place where civilizations did not simply rise and fall, but where they layered themselves upon one another, leaving behind traces, memories, and identities that continued to live on even after power had shifted and borders had changed. If you listen closely, not with urgency, but with patience, you can almost imagine the sound of footsteps across time, not hurried or chaotic, but steady and continuous, as if the land itself has been quietly walking through history, carrying with it the weight of everything it has seen. From the first small settlements that appeared thousands of years ago, to the great empires that stretched across continents, to the modern world that still feels the presence of those distant beginnings. And tonight, we are not going to rush through this journey. We are not going to move quickly from one event to another as if history were a list of facts to be remembered. But instead, we will move slowly, gently, allowing each moment to unfold in its own time, as if you were walking through it yourself, step by step, without effort. Before we begin, take a moment to settle into wherever you are, whether you are lying down after a long day or sitting quietly with your thoughts, and just allow your breathing to slow, because this story is not meant to excite or overwhelm, but to guide you into a calm space where learning and rest can exist together. And as you listen, I want to ask you something simple, something that connects us across distance and time. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? What place surrounds you as you hear these words? What city? What country? What quiet room or familiar space? Because just like the land we are about to explore, every place carries its own story, its own memory, its own sense of time, moving gently forward. Now, imagine that we are standing at the very beginning, not at the height of an empire, not in the presence of kings or armies, but in a much earlier moment, when the land was still being shaped by the people who first chose to settle upon it, when life moved at a slower rhythm, guided by the seasons, by the availability of water, and by the quiet understanding that survival depended on harmony with the environment. The Iranian Plateau, with its mixture of fertile valleys and harsh terrain, did not offer easy living, but it offered something else, something that would define its future, a balance between challenge and opportunity, where those who adapted could not only survive, but build, create, and eventually shape the course of history itself. And as we begin this long journey, moving from those earliest moments through thousands of years of change, through empires that would rise with extraordinary power and fall with quiet inevitability, through invasions that would seem to erase everything and yet somehow leave something behind, through transformations of religion, language, and identity, there is one idea that will remain with us throughout, something that you may begin to notice as the story unfolds, that while rulers may change, while borders may shift, and while names may evolve, there are certain places in the world that never truly disappear, because they are not defined only by power, but by memory, by culture, and by the people who continue to carry that history forward. So now, as the world around you begins to quiet, and as your thoughts begin to slow, let us gently step into the very beginning of this story, into a time long before Persia became an empire, into a land that was still discovering what it would become, and allow yourself to simply listen without effort as the past begins to unfold. Long before the name Persia was ever spoken, long before kings, empires, or armies moved across the land, there existed a quieter world, a slower world, where the story of Iran had already begun to take shape in ways that were simple, almost invisible at first, yet deeply important. Because history does not begin with power, it begins with survival, with small choices made by people who could not have imagined what their land would one day become. The Iranian Plateau, vast and varied, stretched across regions that could be both unforgiving and generous at the same time, where dry deserts met fertile valleys, and where mountains stood like silent protectors over the land, shaping the movement of wind, water, and people. In the earliest moments, when human communities first began to settle here, life was guided not by ambition or expansion, but by necessity, by the search for water, for fertile soil, and for places where the seasons could be understood and anticipated. Early humans moved carefully across this landscape, learning its rhythms, observing the behavior of animals, studying the patterns of the sky, and gradually, almost without realizing it, beginning to transform from wanderers into settlers. Small groups formed near rivers and valleys, building simple shelters, shaping tools from stone and bone, and experimenting with the earliest forms of agriculture, planting seeds in the ground, and waiting patiently for the earth to respond. Imagine, for a moment, one of those early settlers standing at the edge of a small field as the sun begins to rise, watching as the first signs of growth appear in the soil, a quiet realization forming in his mind that life no longer needed to be followed endlessly across the land, but could instead be nurtured in one place, that the earth itself could provide if understood with care and patience. And in that moment, without any grand announcement, without any sense of history being made, something changed, because the act of settling, of building, of returning to the same place again and again, began to create something deeper than survival. It began to create memory. As generations passed, these small settlements grew more stable, more organized, and more connected to one another, and slowly, the foundations of early civilization began to emerge. Not suddenly, but gradually, as people learned to shape their environment, to store food, to create tools that were more refined, and to build structures that could last beyond a single season. And it was within this growing complexity that one of the earliest great civilizations of this land began to take form. A civilization that would stand at the crossroads of ancient worlds, known today as the Elamites. The Elamite civilization, centered around the ancient city of Susa, emerged as one of the first organized societies in this region, not isolated from the world, but deeply connected to it, particularly to the powerful civilizations of Mesopotamia to the west. The city of Susa became more than just a place of living. It became a center of activity, of trade, of communication, where goods moved across distances and ideas traveled alongside them, carried by merchants, travelers, and officials who navigated the growing networks of early human interaction. Within its walls, people began to record information, to develop early systems of writing, to construct buildings that reflected both function and identity, and to organize their society in ways that allowed for continuity and structure. If you imagine walking through Susa in those distant times, you would not see the overwhelming scale of later empires, but you would sense something equally important: the presence of order, of intention, of a society that understood itself as something more than a collection of individuals, a place where roles were defined, where leadership existed, and where the idea of a shared identity was beginning to take shape. Conversations would unfold in the marketplace, not about conquest or dominance, but about trade, about resources, about cooperation. And in those quiet exchanges, the early foundations of civilization continued to strengthen. Yet even as the Elamites built their world, the land around them was not static, because movement has always been a part of this region's history, and over time, new groups began to arrive, traveling from distant regions, bringing with them different languages, different traditions, and different ways of life. Among these groups were the Indo-Iranian tribes, whose gradual arrival introduced new dynamics into the landscape as they settled, interacted, and sometimes competed with the populations already present. From this movement, from this blending and reshaping of cultures, new structures of power began to emerge, and among them, the Medes rose as a significant force. forming early kingdoms that extended beyond simple settlements and into organized political entities. The Medes did not appear suddenly as a unified empire, but rather developed over time, as tribes formed alliances, as leaders gained influence, and as the need for coordination in the face of external threats encouraged greater unity. One of the defining moments in the rise of the Medes came with their role in the fall of the Assyrian Empire, a power that had dominated much of the region with strength and authority, yet had also created resistance through its harsh control. The Medes, alongside their allies, contributed to the weakening and eventual defeat of Assyria, an event that not only shifted the balance of power, but also demonstrated that new forces were emerging, capable of challenging even the most established empires. Imagine a quiet evening in a Median settlement after such a victory, where leaders gather not in celebration alone, but in discussion, speaking in measured tones about what comes next, about how power should be organized, about how different groups can be held together under a shared purpose. One voice might say, "We are no longer just tribes moving across the land," while another responds, "Then we must learn to stand as something more." And in those moments, something begins to form. Not yet an empire, but the early idea of one. The understanding that unity could create strength and that identity could extend beyond individual groups. It is here, in this gradual transformation, that we begin to see the first true sense of what would later become Iranian identity, not defined by a single ruler or a single city, but by a shared cultural and linguistic foundation that connected different peoples across the region. This identity did not replace older traditions, but absorbed them, blending elements of the past with new influences, creating something that was both rooted and evolving at the same time. And as this part of the story comes to rest, as the early settlements have grown into civilizations, and as those civilizations have begun to form the structures of power and identity, we find ourselves standing at a quiet turning point, a moment where the land has prepared itself for something greater, something that has not yet fully appeared, but is already beginning to take shape beneath the surface. Because soon, from among these peoples, from within this shared identity and growing sense of unity, there will rise a new force, not just a kingdom, not just a collection of tribes, but an empire, one that will stretch farther than anything this land has seen before, one that will carry the name Persia into history. And as you rest and allow this moment to settle, imagine that slow transition from scattered settlements to organized societies, from societies to kingdoms, and from kingdoms to something far greater, as the quiet beginnings of this land prepare to give rise to one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. As the early civilizations of the Iranian Plateau slowly shaped themselves into structured societies, and as the Medes established one of the first organized powers across the region, there came a moment, quiet at first, and almost unnoticeable to those living within it, when leadership would pass into the hands of someone who would transform not just a kingdom, but the entire course of history. Because from within the world of tribes, alliances, and emerging identity, there rose a figure whose vision extended far beyond what had existed before. A man remembered as Cyrus the Great. Cyrus did not begin as the ruler of a vast empire, but as a leader within a smaller Persian group that existed under the influence of the Medes. And yet, even in those early stages, there was something about his leadership that set him apart, not in loud declarations or dramatic displays of power, but in the way he understood people, in the way he built trust, and in the way he saw opportunity, not only in strength, but in unity. Over time, his influence grew, alliances formed around him, and eventually, he challenged the Median rule itself, not through chaos, but through a carefully built movement that culminated in the overthrow of the Medes, a moment that did not simply replace one ruler with another, but marked the beginning of something entirely new. With the Medes now under his authority, Cyrus did not destroy what had come before, but instead incorporated it, blending Persian and Median strengths into a unified structure. And from this foundation, he began to expand, not as a conqueror driven solely by domination, but as a builder of systems, a creator of an empire that would stretch across vast distances while maintaining a sense of order and connection. His campaigns carried him westward, where he eventually reached one of the most powerful and symbolic cities of the ancient world, Babylon, a place known for its wealth, its culture, and its deep historical roots. When Cyrus entered Babylon, the moment did not unfold with destruction, but with a different approach, one that would define his legacy, as he allowed local traditions to continue, respected religious practices, and positioned himself not as a destroyer, but as a ruler who could bring stability. It is said that in his interactions with the people, there was a sense of calm authority, a quiet assurance that life would continue, that the structures of society would remain intact, and that under his rule, diversity would not be erased, but accepted. In this way, Cyrus established something that extended beyond military success. He established a model of governance that relied on tolerance, on respect, and on the understanding that an empire could be held together, not only by force, but by trust. As the empire grew under Cyrus, it began to take on a form that was both vast and organized, stretching across regions that differed in language, culture, and tradition, yet were connected through systems that allowed for communication and movement on a scale rarely seen before. Roads were built, not merely as paths for armies, but as channels of connection, allowing messages, goods, and people to travel across long distances with a level of efficiency that strengthened the unity of the empire. These roads were maintained carefully, supported by a network of stations where riders could rest and exchange horses, ensuring that information could move quickly, binding distant regions together into a single functioning whole. Within this growing structure, local governance was preserved, with regional leaders maintaining control over their own customs and practices, while still operating under the authority of the empire, creating a balance that allowed for both diversity and unity. Imagine a conversation between a local governor and a Persian official, where the governor says, "Our people have always followed these traditions," and the official replies, then let them continue as long as peace remains, reflecting a system that valued stability over uniformity. After Cyrus, the empire continued to evolve, and under the leadership of Darius I, it reached a level of organization and expansion that transformed it into one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world. Darius approached governance with precision and structure, dividing the empire into provinces, each overseen by appointed officials who were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring loyalty to the central authority. This system allowed the empire to function efficiently despite its vast size, creating a network of administration that extended from one end of the empire to the other. Darius also introduced standardized systems of taxation, ensuring that resources could be collected and distributed in a way that supported both the military and the infrastructure of the empire, while also establishing a common currency that facilitated trade and economic activity. Under his rule, construction projects flourished, including the development of grand cities and ceremonial centers that reflected the power and sophistication of Persian culture. And the continued expansion of roads and communication networks strengthened the cohesion of the empire even further. Yet as the empire expanded, it inevitably came into contact with other regions, and among them were the independent Greek city-states to the west, whose traditions of autonomy and resistance created a dynamic very different from the regions that had already been integrated into Persian rule. The interactions between Persia and Greece began as political and territorial disputes, but gradually escalated into conflict, leading to a series of confrontations that would become some of the most remembered events of the ancient world, including the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. These conflicts were not simply battles of armies, but encounters between different systems of organization, between an empire that relied on vast resources and centralized authority, and city-states that depended on cooperation, strategy, and a strong sense of identity. The outcomes of these battles were mixed, with victories and defeats on both sides. But they marked a turning point in the perception of Persian power, demonstrating that even a vast empire could face resistance that could not be easily overcome. As time passed, the strength of the Persian Empire began to shift, not through a single event, but through a combination of internal challenges, external pressures, and the gradual weakening that can occur in even the most powerful systems. And then, from the west, there emerged another figure, a young leader whose ambitions extended across the known world, Alexander the Great, whose campaigns would bring him into direct confrontation with Persia. Alexander's advance was swift and determined, moving through regions that had once been secure under Persian control, defeating Persian forces in a series of battles that gradually dismantled the structure of the empire. As he moved deeper into Persian territory, the resistance weakened, and eventually, the great empire that had been built by Cyrus, expanded by Darius, and sustained by generations of rulers, came to an end around 330 BCE, not disappearing entirely, but transforming as its systems, culture, and identity continued to influence the world even under new leadership. And so, as this part of the story gently comes to rest, we find ourselves at another turning point, where the first great Persian Empire has risen, flourished, and fallen, yet the land itself remains, carrying forward the memory of what has been built, ready once again to reshape itself in the centuries to come as new powers rise, new identities form, and the long history of Iran continues its quiet, steady journey through time. As the great Persian Empire of Cyrus and Darius faded into the past under the campaigns of Alexander the Great, the land of Iran did not fall into silence, nor did it lose its identity, because while empires may collapse, the lands they ruled often continue to carry their memory, their traditions, and their sense of self, quietly waiting for the next transformation to begin. In the years that followed Alexander's death, his vast conquests did not remain united, but instead fractured into separate kingdoms, each ruled by his generals. And among these emerging powers, the region of Persia came under the control of the Seleucid Empire, a Hellenistic state that sought to extend Greek influence across the lands that had once belonged to the Persians. Under Seleucid rule, the Iranian Plateau experienced a blending of cultures that unfolded gradually as Greek language, art, and administrative practices were introduced into a land that already possessed its own deep traditions, creating a unique environment where different identities existed side by side. Cities began to reflect this mixture, with elements of Greek architecture appearing alongside older Persian structures, and marketplaces where conversations could be heard in multiple languages, each carrying its own rhythm and meaning. Yet beneath this surface of cultural exchange, there remained a quiet persistence of local identity, a sense that while foreign influence could shape the present, it could not fully replace what had been built over centuries. Imagine a moment in one of these cities where a local craftsman speaks with a Greek official, the craftsman explaining the patterns and meanings behind traditional designs, while the official listens with curiosity, perhaps even appreciation. And in that exchange, there exists not conflict, but coexistence, a temporary balance between old and new. However, this balance was not permanent because the Seleucid control over these lands was often distant, stretched thin across vast territories, and over time, new forces began to emerge from within the region itself, ready to reclaim a more distinctly Iranian form of power. Among these rising powers were the Parthians, a people whose origins lay in the eastern regions, whose strength came not from rigid structures, but from mobility, adaptability, and a deep understanding of warfare shaped by their environment. The Parthians did not establish their dominance overnight, but gradually expanded their influence, taking advantage of the weakening Seleucid control, building alliances, and asserting their presence across the Iranian plateau. Their rise marked a return to local rule, but not in the same form as the earlier Persian Empire, because their system of governance was more decentralized, allowing regional leaders a degree of autonomy while still maintaining loyalty to the Parthian kings. The Parthian way of war reflected their origins, with cavalry playing a central role, warriors skilled in mounted combat, capable of moving quickly across open terrain, striking with precision, and withdrawing before their opponents could respond effectively. This style of warfare would bring them into direct conflict with one of the most powerful forces of the time, the Roman Empire, whose expansion eastward eventually brought its legions into confrontation with Parthian armies. These encounters between Parthia and Rome became a defining feature of the era, not as a single decisive war, but as a series of ongoing conflicts, shifting borders and repeated engagements that stretched across generations. The Romans, known for their discipline and structured formations, found themselves facing an opponent whose tactics were unfamiliar, whose mobility disrupted their expectations, and whose ability to control the pace of battle often turned the advantage away from sheer numbers. One can imagine a Roman general standing on the battlefield, watching Parthian riders move in and out of range, arrows striking from a distance, and realizing that this was not a war that could be fought in the usual way. Within Parthian society, power was shared among noble families and regional leaders, creating a system that was flexible but sometimes unstable, as internal rivalries could weaken the unity needed to sustain long-term control. Over time, this internal fragmentation created opportunities for change, and from within the Iranian world itself, a new power began to rise, one that would seek not only to reclaim the legacy of earlier empires, but to strengthen it with a more centralized and enduring structure, the Sassanian Empire. Under the leadership of Ardashir I, the Sassanians established a new dynasty that placed strong emphasis on centralized authority, organized governance, and a clear sense of identity rooted in Persian tradition. Unlike the Parthians, whose system allowed for significant regional autonomy, the Sassanians worked to bring the empire under tighter control, creating a more unified state that could operate with greater consistency and strength. At the same time, they revived and elevated the role of Zoroastrianism, positioning it as a central element of the empire's identity, integrating religious and political authority in a way that reinforced both. The Sassanian period became a time of cultural and architectural achievement, with the construction of grand cities, palaces, and structures that reflected both artistic skill and imperial ambition. Trade flourished along routes that connected the empire to distant regions, and the exchange of goods and ideas continued to shape the cultural landscape. Imagine walking through a Sassanian city where large arches rise above you, where markets are filled with voices and movement, and where the presence of authority is visible not only in soldiers and officials, but in the very design of the environment itself. Yet even as the Sassanians strengthened their internal structure, the external pressures did not disappear, and once again, the empire found itself in conflict with a powerful Western neighbor, the Roman Empire, which later evolved into the Byzantine Empire. These wars were not brief or isolated, but extended over long periods, draining resources, testing endurance, and creating cycles of conflict that left both sides weakened over time. Battles were fought across borders, territories changed hands, and each victory or defeat became part of a larger pattern that seemed to repeat without resolution. Imagine two commanders, one Sassanian and one Byzantine, each standing in their respective camps after a long campaign, both aware that the struggle has not ended, both understanding that even victory brings only temporary advantage, because the other side will return, prepared once again to fight. And in that shared awareness, there exists a quiet understanding that these endless wars, while defining the era, are also slowly exhausting the very empires that sustain them. As the years passed, the cumulative effect of these conflicts became increasingly visible as resources were stretched, populations were affected, and the ability to maintain stability weakened, not suddenly, but gradually in ways that were not always immediately apparent. And it was in this moment of exhaustion, when two great powers had spent decades confronting each other, that something new began to emerge, not from the established centers of power, but from a region to the south, from lands that had not previously stood at the center of imperial history. And so, as this part of the story gently settles, as the cycles of conquest, collapse, and rebirth have once again reshaped the Iranian world, we arrive at another quiet turning point, where the stage has been set for a transformation that will not only change Iran, but will also influence the course of history far beyond it. Because from the deserts of Arabia, a new force is beginning to rise, one that will carry with it not just armies, but a new belief, a new identity, and a new chapter in the long and continuous story of this ancient land. As the long era of the Sassanian Empire reached its final years, weakened by decades of exhausting conflict and internal strain, the land of Iran stood at a quiet but decisive turning point, a moment where the structures that had defined power for centuries were no longer able to hold, and where a new force, emerging from the Arabian Peninsula, began to move outward with a momentum that would reshape the region in ways no one could have fully anticipated. The arrival of the early Islamic armies did not come as a single overwhelming event, but as a series of encounters, battles, and gradual advances that, over time, led to the collapse of Sassanian resistance and the integration of Iran into a rapidly expanding Islamic world. In those early moments of contact, the transition was not immediate or uniform, because the land itself was vast and its people diverse. And while the political structure of the Sassanian state fell, the deeper layers of society, culture, and identity remained, adapting slowly to the new reality. Islam entered Iran not only as a system of belief, but as a framework that would influence governance, law, and daily life. And yet, as it spread, it encountered a civilization that already possessed a strong cultural foundation, one that did not disappear, but instead began to interact with this new influence, creating something unique and enduring. The older traditions, including the practices of Zoroastrianism, gradually declined in prominence, not always through force, but often through the natural process of change, as new generations grew within the Islamic system and adopted its practices as part of their identity. Yet even as religious life transformed, the Persian sense of culture, language, and artistic expression did not fade, but instead found new ways to exist within this evolving world, blending elements of the past with the structures of the present. Imagine a scholar sitting in a quiet room, surrounded by scrolls, writing in a language that carries echoes of the past, while expressing ideas shaped by the present, speaking of philosophy, science, and poetry in ways that reflect both Islamic thought and Persian heritage. And in that moment, you can see how transformation does not always erase what came before, but often reshapes it into something new. This blending gave rise to what is often called Persian Islamic culture, a synthesis that would become one of the most influential intellectual and artistic traditions in the world. During this period, knowledge flourished, not in isolation, but through connection, as scholars, poets, and thinkers contributed to a wider intellectual movement that extended across the Islamic world, yet retained a distinctly Persian voice. Advances in science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy emerged alongside works of poetry and literature that explored themes of existence, love, and the nature of life itself, and the Persian language, rather than disappearing, experienced a revival, becoming a medium through which culture and identity could continue to be expressed across generations. However, this period of cultural richness was not free from disruption, because the Iranian world, positioned at the crossroads of continents, remained vulnerable to the movements of powerful forces from beyond its borders. Turkic groups began to enter the region, establishing new dynasties and introducing additional layers of cultural and political influence. And while these changes brought both conflict and adaptation, they also contributed to the ongoing evolution of the region's identity. Then, in the 13th century, a force arrived that would test the resilience of this land more severely than any before. The Mongols, whose campaigns moved across vast territories with a speed and intensity that left cities destroyed, populations displaced, and entire regions transformed in a matter of years. The impact of the Mongol invasions was profound, as centers of learning were disrupted, infrastructure was damaged, and the sense of continuity that had defined earlier periods was shaken deeply. Imagine a once thriving city, now quiet, its streets empty, its buildings damaged, and its people scattered. And in that silence, there is a sense of loss that cannot be easily measured. A break in the flow of history that feels almost final. And yet, even in that moment, the story does not end, because slowly, over time, life begins to return. Structures are rebuilt, and communities reorganize themselves, drawing upon the same resilience that had carried this land through earlier transformations. What is most remarkable about this period is not only the scale of change and disruption, but the way in which Persian identity endured through it all, adapting to new rulers, new systems, and new influences, while maintaining a continuity that could not be fully erased. Language, literature, and cultural memory acted as threads that connected past and present, allowing each generation to rebuild upon what remained, and in doing so, strengthening the sense of identity rather than weakening it. As the centuries of transformation, invasion, and adaptation gradually gave way to a new phase of consolidation, there emerged from within the Iranian world a movement that would once again unify the land under a single authority, creating a structure that would shape the foundations of what we now recognize as modern Iran. At the center of this transformation stood Shah Ismail I, a leader whose rise combined elements of spirituality, military strength, and political vision, allowing him to gather support and establish control over a region that had long experienced fragmentation. Shah Ismail's unification of Iran was not only a political achievement, but also a defining moment in the religious identity of the region, as he established Twelver Shia Islam as the official faith, creating a distinction that would influence the course of Iranian history for centuries to come. This decision was not simply about belief, but about identity, about creating a shared framework that could unify diverse populations under a common understanding, and in doing so, strengthening the cohesion of the state. The establishment of this identity brought Iran into direct and ongoing interaction with neighboring powers, particularly the Ottoman Empire, whose Sunni orientation contrasted with the Shia identity of the Safavid state, creating a dynamic of rivalry that extended beyond territory into the realm of belief and influence. These conflicts, while often expressed through military engagements, also reflected deeper differences in how each side understood its role within the broader Islamic world. Despite these challenges, the Safavid period became a time of remarkable cultural achievement, as stability allowed for the growth of art, architecture, and trade, transforming cities into centers of beauty and activity. Among these, the city of Isfahan stood out as a symbol of this flourishing, with its grand squares, intricate mosques, and vibrant markets, creating an environment where daily life and artistic expression blended seamlessly. Imagine walking through Isfahan during this period, where the sound of water flows through carefully designed channels, where merchants display goods from distant lands, and where the architecture itself seems to tell a story of balance, symmetry, and beauty. And in that moment, you can feel the presence of a civilization that has not only survived centuries of change, but has found a way to express itself with confidence and grace. Yet, as with all empires, the Safavid state would eventually face challenges that tested its stability, as internal divisions, external pressures, and the natural cycles of power began to weaken its structure, leading to a gradual decline that would open the way for new forces and new transformations. And as this part of the story gently comes to rest, we find ourselves once again at a quiet transition, where the achievements of one era begin to fade, and the next chapter, shaped by new struggles and new possibilities, waits just beyond the horizon. As the Safavid Empire slowly faded into the past, its once strong structure weakened by internal divisions and external pressures, the land of Iran once again entered a period of uncertainty, where power no longer moved with the same clarity or stability, and where the sense of unity that had defined earlier eras began to dissolve into a more fragile and unpredictable reality. This was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual unraveling, where authority became contested, where leadership shifted quickly, and where the balance that had once held the region together gave way to a landscape shaped by ambition, conflict, and the constant search for control. From within this uncertainty, there emerged a figure whose presence would briefly restore strength and direction, a man known as Nader Shah, whose rise was marked not by inherited power, but by his ability to navigate chaos with precision, discipline, and an understanding of warfare that allowed him to succeed where others had failed. Nader Shah did not begin as a king, but as a military leader, building his position step by step, gaining loyalty through victories, and gradually consolidating authority until he stood at the center of a newly formed state. Under his command, the Iranian forces regained a level of strength that had not been seen since earlier imperial periods, as campaigns extended beyond the borders of Iran, reaching into neighboring regions and even as far as India, where his army captured immense wealth. His leadership restored a sense of power and momentum, creating the impression that the cycles of instability had been broken and that a new era of expansion had begun. Imagine soldiers standing in formation under his command, their confidence returning, their belief in victory strengthened by repeated success, and for a moment, it seemed as though the land had once again found its direction. Yet beneath this resurgence, there remained a tension that could not be easily resolved, because the stability created by Nader Shah depended heavily on his personal leadership. And when that leadership ended, the structure he had built began to weaken, revealing that the deeper foundations of unity had not fully recovered. After his death, the empire he had expanded quickly fragmented as rival factions competed for control, and the sense of order gave way once again to division and uncertainty. From this fragmentation, a new ruling house eventually emerged, the Qajar dynasty, which would govern Iran through a period marked not by expansion or consolidation, but by struggle, adaptation, and the increasing influence of forces beyond its borders. The Qajar rulers faced a reality very different from that of earlier empires, because while they held authority within the country, their ability to control events was limited by internal weaknesses and external pressures that continued to grow over time. Within the Qajar state, governance was often inconsistent, shaped by competing interests, regional power structures, and a lack of centralized strength that made it difficult to maintain stability across the entire territory. Imagine a ruler seated in a grand hall, surrounded by advisors whose opinions differ, each offering solutions that address immediate concerns but fail to resolve the larger challenges. And in that atmosphere, decisions become reactive rather than strategic, shaped by the need to manage crises rather than to prevent them. At the same time, the position of Iran within the broader world began to shift as powerful neighboring empires turned their attention toward the region, not as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as competitors seeking influence, resources, and strategic advantage. Among these powers were Russia and Britain, whose interests in Iran created a dynamic of external involvement that would have lasting consequences. This competition, often referred to as a form of geopolitical rivalry, brought increasing pressure upon the Qajar state as treaties were negotiated, territories were contested, and influence was exerted through both diplomacy and force. In some cases, Iran was compelled to cede land or accept conditions that limited its sovereignty, not through direct conquest, but through the gradual expansion of foreign control into its political and economic systems. Imagine a negotiation table where Iranian representatives sit across from foreign officials. The conversation calm, but weighted, each agreement carrying implications that extend far beyond the moment, shaping the future in ways that are not immediately visible. As these external pressures grew, internal conditions also became more difficult, as economic challenges affected daily life, creating hardships that were felt across different layers of society. Agricultural instability, combined with administrative inefficiencies, contributed to periods of famine, where food became scarce and communities struggled to sustain themselves. In villages and towns, families faced uncertainty, not only about the future, but about the present, as resources diminished and the systems meant to support them proved insufficient. Imagine a quiet evening in such a village, where a family gathers around a small meal, speaking softly about the difficulties they face, about the uncertainty of the next season, and about the hope that conditions might improve. And in that moment, the larger movements of empires and politics feel distant, yet their effects are deeply present, shaping lives in ways that are both immediate and lasting. This period, marked by instability, foreign influence, and economic struggle, did not represent the end of the Iranian story, but rather another phase within its long and continuous evolution, where challenges tested the resilience of the land and its people once again. And as this chapter gently comes to rest, we find ourselves at another quiet turning point, where the pressures of the past begin to give rise to new ideas, new movements, and a desire for change that will soon reshape the direction of the country. Because from within this period of hardship and external control, there will emerge a new awareness, a new push toward reform, identity, and independence, leading Iran into the modern age, where the story will once again transform, carrying forward the memory of everything that has come before. As the long and difficult period of instability under the Qajar rulers gradually gave way to the early years of the 20th century, the land of Iran began to experience a different kind of movement, not one driven by conquest or invasion, but by ideas, by conversations, and by a growing awareness among its people that the structures of power and governance could no longer remain as they had been. This was a quieter kind of transformation at first, one that did not unfold on battlefields, but in gatherings, in discussions, and in the shared realization that a nation shaped by such a long and complex history deserved a system that reflected the needs and voices of its people. From this awareness emerged what would become known as the Persian Constitutional Revolution, a movement that sought not to destroy the state, but to reform it, to introduce law, representation, and accountability into a system that had long struggled with imbalance. In cities and towns, people from different backgrounds came together: merchants, scholars, workers, and leaders, each carrying their own concerns, but united by a common desire for change. And in those gatherings, one could imagine conversations unfolding slowly, where one voice might say, "We need laws that protect us," while another responds, "and a system that listens." And through such exchanges, the foundation of modern political thought in Iran began to take shape. The result of this movement was the establishment of a constitution and a parliament, a structure that introduced the idea that authority could be guided by agreed principles rather than absolute rule, marking a significant shift in how power was understood and exercised. Yet, as with many moments of transformation, the path forward was not simple or stable, because the introduction of new systems often brings new challenges, and the balance between traditional authority and modern governance proved difficult to maintain. In this environment of change and uncertainty, a new figure rose to prominence, a man whose vision for Iran centered on strength, modernization, and control: Reza Shah. His rise marked the beginning of the Pahlavi dynasty, a period that would reshape the country in ways that were both transformative and complex. Reza Shah approached leadership with a focus on building a strong, centralized state, one that could resist foreign influence, maintain internal order, and bring Iran into alignment with the modern world. Under his rule, efforts were made to develop infrastructure, to expand industry, and to create institutions that reflected a more modern system of governance. And while these changes brought progress in many areas, they also required adjustments from a society deeply connected to its traditions. Imagine a street in Tehran during this period, where older buildings stand beside new constructions, where traditional clothing blends with modern styles, and where the pace of life begins to shift, reflecting a society in transition. Education expanded, transportation networks improved, and the presence of the state became more visible in daily life as reforms touched various aspects of society, from administration to culture. At the same time, the influence of Western ideas and systems grew, shaping both policy and perception as Iran engaged more directly with global developments, seeking to position itself within a rapidly changing world. This interaction brought opportunities, but also introduced new tensions, as the balance between preserving identity and embracing change became an ongoing challenge. As the world moved toward the global conflict of the Second World War, Iran's strategic position and resources drew the attention of major powers, and during this period, foreign forces entered the country, creating a situation where control was once again influenced from outside its borders. The presence of these forces added to the complexity of the political environment, as decisions were shaped not only by internal considerations, but by the broader dynamics of global conflict and competition. In those years, one can imagine a sense of uncertainty spreading through the population, as news of events beyond Iran's borders influenced life within it, and as the presence of foreign troops served as a reminder that independence, though sought and valued, remained difficult to fully secure. Political instability followed, as leadership changed, and different visions for the country's future competed for influence, creating a landscape where direction was not always clear, and where the legacy of past struggles continued to shape present realities. At the same time, another factor began to define Iran's importance on the global stage: its vast reserves of oil, a resource that would transform the country's economy and its relationship with the wider world. Oil brought wealth, but also attention, as foreign powers recognized its strategic value and sought to influence how it was controlled and distributed. This created a new dimension of interaction, where economic interests became deeply connected to political decisions, and where the balance of power extended beyond borders into agreements, negotiations, and interventions. Imagine discussions taking place in government halls, where leaders consider how to manage these resources, how to balance national interests with external pressures, and how to navigate a world where economic strength can attract both partnership and interference. In these moments, the complexity of modern Iran becomes clear as the country stands at the intersection of its own history and the expectations of a global system that is constantly evolving. And so, as this part of the story gently comes to rest, we see a nation that has moved from traditional structures into the beginnings of modern statehood, shaped by reform, challenged by external influence, and defined by a continuing search for identity and stability. The journey has not been simple, and the questions raised during this period have not yet been fully answered, because just beyond this moment, another transformation awaits, one that will once again reshape the direction of Iran in ways that are both profound and lasting. As the 20th century moved toward its final decades, the land of Iran, shaped by centuries of transformation, empire, reform, and external pressure, found itself once again standing at a quiet but powerful turning point, where the direction of the nation would no longer be defined only by gradual change, but by a sudden and profound shift that would alter its political structure, its identity, and its place in the world. The years leading up to this moment were filled with growing tension as different groups within society began to express dissatisfaction in different ways, some concerned with political freedom, others with cultural preservation, and many with the influence of foreign powers that seemed to remain present in decisions that affected the country's future. In cities across Iran, voices began to rise, not all at once, but steadily, as gatherings formed, as discussions turned into movements, and as a shared sense of urgency began to spread through the population, creating a collective momentum that could no longer be easily contained. Imagine the streets of Tehran during those days, filled not with silence, but with people moving together, speaking, calling out, carrying with them a sense that something significant was unfolding, something that could not be reversed once it had begun. And at the center of this transformation stood a figure whose influence reached far beyond politics, Ruhollah Khomeini, whose message resonated deeply with many who saw in it a path toward a different kind of future. The events of Iranian Revolution unfolded with a speed and intensity that reflected the depth of the changes taking place within society, leading to the fall of the monarchy and the end of the Pahlavi era, a system that had sought to modernize the country, but it also created divisions that now reached a breaking point. In its place, a new political structure emerged, one that was not simply a continuation of past systems, but a redefinition of governance itself, establishing an Islamic republic where religious leadership played a central role in shaping both law and policy. This new system introduced a different balance between authority and belief, where governance was guided not only by political institutions, but by religious principles that were seen as integral to the identity of the nation. For many, this represented a return to values that had long been part of the country's cultural foundation, while for others, it raised new questions about the relationship between tradition and change, about how a nation with such a long and diverse history could define itself in the modern world. Imagine conversations taking place in homes and public spaces, where people speak quietly about what has changed, about what has remained, and about what the future might hold, each voice reflecting a different perspective, yet all connected by the shared experience of living through a moment of transformation. Not long after the revolution, the country faced another challenge, one that would test its resilience in a different way, as conflict broke out with neighboring Iraq, leading to a war that would last for years and leave a lasting impact on both nations. The Iran-Iraq War was not a brief or isolated conflict, but a prolonged struggle that affected cities, communities, and families, creating a reality where the experience of war became part of daily life for many. Imagine a quiet home during those years, where a family gathers together in the evening, listening to distant sounds, speaking softly about loved ones, about hope, and about endurance. And in those moments, the larger movements of history become deeply personal, shaping not only the direction of the country, but the lives of individuals who carry those experiences forward. Despite the destruction and hardship, the war also revealed a strong sense of resilience, a capacity to endure and to continue, even under the most difficult circumstances. As the years passed, and the immediate challenges of revolution and war began to settle into memory, Iran entered a new phase, one shaped by both continuity and change, where the structures established after 1979 remained, but where society itself continued to evolve. The country's relationship with the wider world became complex, influenced by political tensions, economic considerations, and differing perspectives on its role in global affairs, creating a dynamic where interaction was both present and limited, shaped by factors that extended beyond its borders. And yet, within the country, life continued to move forward, shaped not only by politics, but by culture, by creativity, and by the everyday experiences of its people. A new generation grew up in a world different from that of their parents, connected through technology, influenced by both local traditions and global ideas, and carrying with them a sense of identity that reflects both the past and the present. Imagine a young student sitting in a modern classroom, using digital tools while learning about ancient history, aware of the long journey that has brought their country to this point, and at the same time, looking toward a future that is still being written. What becomes clear in this final part of the story is that Iran, like it has done so many times before, continues to exist not as a fixed idea, but as a living, evolving reality, shaped by its history but not limited by it, carrying forward traditions while adapting to new circumstances, and maintaining a sense of identity that has survived through empires, invasions, revolutions, and change. And now, as this long journey comes to rest, imagine once more that vast land, the mountains standing quietly beneath the sky, the deserts stretching endlessly into the distance, the cities alive with memory and movement. Thousands of years have passed. Kings have risen and fallen. Empires have expanded and disappeared. Worlds have changed again and again. And yet, this land remained. Not because it was never conquered, but because it was never forgotten. Because each time it was broken, it reshaped itself. Each time it was changed, it carried something forward. And so tonight, as your thoughts begin to slow and your mind begins to rest, remember this quiet truth that some places in this world do not survive because they are strong, but because they endure. Now, take a slow breath. Let the story fade gently into silence and allow yourself to rest.